Welcome to Puro Politics, the political podcast of the San Antonio Express News. My name is Gilbert Garcia, Metro columnist, and I'm joined by
environmental reporter Josh Ball,
business editor Greg Jefferson,
Brian Chasnoff, investigative reporter.
And I think this is a particularly busy week, or the last week has been. And I wanted to start off with what I'm guessing will probably be our last words on the Greg Brockhouse mayoral campaign. Last Wednesday,
until the next mayoral campaign.
That's right. That's right. I'm talking about this cycle.
He's already started campaigning. If you haven't noticed,
it's as the Clintons used to call it, the never-ending campaign or something like that. Last week, Greg Brockhouse and his wife Annalisa did an interview on KSAT TV with Steve Spriester. The full interview, which was is available online, was like 32 minutes, and they addressed the issue, the story that Brian broke back in March, involving there are two allegations against Greg Brockhouse, domestic violence allegations, but the second one was the one that there was always a lot of mystery about because that police report had disappeared, and he and his supporters had kind of suggested that there was something, that maybe this thing wasn't real or it was fraudulent or something. Last Wednesday, they finally addressed that. And what did you make of that, Brian? As somebody who really, you were really the person who got the story out.
Just to give a quick recap, Annalisa did most of the talking at the beginning, and the way that I saw was that she blamed herself and her postpartum depression after the birth of their son for calling the police. So she acknowledged calling the police, which was the first time they'd ever done that. She also acknowledged that the report had been expunged, which we had speculated about for months,
and said that she was the main person behind getting that done.
Right. She says they got into an argument about breast milk, that Greg had told her to put the breast milk in the freezer. She did not put the breast milk in the freezer. This caused an argument. Greg left the house. She called police out of some sort of vengeance against Greg because she was out of her head due to the depression.
There's so much to unpack here. I mean, one of the things that I've heard, from women I've talked to in the past week, and I'm not saying that this is a universal sentiment, but there's some maybe resentment over the use of postpartum depression as a way of kind of explaining this away. Because I mean, this is something that many women deal with, and I think it's pretty rare that it ends up leading to a situation like this, or to say that postpartum depression would necessarily account for someone doing something as irrational as what they're describing here.
Well, the way that I frame this in conversation is they zeroed in on the one aspect of the story that no one will be able to disprove, which is what occurred between the two of them inside the house. Through our reporting, we proved that police showed up to the house and that the report disappeared. And they denied those things for months, and they suggested that the report was a fake, that the Express News, the fake news media, had made the whole thing up in order to help Ron Nuremberg. But finally, they were up against a wall, and they had to come up with a story that vindicated them in their minds. And so they zeroed in on the one aspect of the story that no one can ever disprove, which is what happened between them in the house.
And there are two ways of looking at this politically, because I think most of us believe Greg Brockhouse has intentions of running for political office again. One is that his supporters may look and say, "Well, see, this there's a good explanation for this, and they didn't want to talk about it before, but he didn't do anything wrong." And then there's another side of this, which is that there was a report all along, and they sort of led people to believe that there wasn't, and so he could play
not
two
sort
ways.
of. Yeah, when I first showed him the report, or when I first approached him and said, "What about this report?" He said, "I don't know about any report."
That's right, and that was constantly his answer.
He lied immediately.
When asked if did the police come to your house or was this a fake report, he would usually kind of shift he would go off in a different direction and never really directly answer that. But
I think clearly, he to me, this is like a tacit acknowledgement that, this cost him the election. He came within 2 points of beating Nuremberg, who was, he was a weak candidate. He was already wounded, but he lost probably for this very reason.
Yeah.
He's, I think it's not a surprise that a lot of people think he's going to run for mayor again. I mean, he's a political animal, and I just don't believe that he's finished with politics.
Yeah,
especially citywide politics. So he had to deal with this. This is how he chose to do it. I think. I do think we have to be careful talking about postpartum depression. It is a real thing.
Absolutely.
I mean, this is a lot of people will listen to Annalisa, and this will sound entirely plausible to them, and it's not some kind of manufactured story.
Right.
They'll see it as a real thing. And I think 2 years hence, I think he probably did go a long way in defanging this story.
And the thing is, I mean, we, as you said, I mean, we don't know what happened, and we don't know that the story that they're telling now is not true or is true, and that's why I think the thing that ultimately I came away with was just we don't. A couple of things. One is that his story or his future political career really depends on believing that two different women. Two that he was married to have lied to the police in saying that he committed acts of violence against them, and people can decide whether they want to make come to that conclusion. But the other thing is that, as you talked about, Brian, I mean, he was dishonest in the way he treated this issue all through the campaign. There's a major trust issue here, and setting aside the particulars of what happened that night, whether you believe it or you don't believe it, how he handled it in this election. I think has done irreparable harm in some people's minds for his ability to face the public and tell the truth. And so, he may have explained it away, and when he comes back and runs another campaign, he may have put that issue to bed in that there was, police called to his house on that night, but he's still going to have to address the way that he handled it throughout the campaign, this cycle. And that's going to be something that probably haunts him.
Well, his argument now is that he did not want to put his wife through the scrutiny of, I presume, her postpartum depression.
Sure, but he flat out lied about this issue, right? I mean, he denied that there was a report. He knew that there was a report. He knew that the police had come. And yes, he had the right under expungement law to be able to deny that. But that's like a given kind of set of parameters for
I mean,
law,
it was
right?
just lying. I mean, it was very, his explanation was very legalistic. And it was, but it rang absurd. I mean,
it did, but beyond being a ridiculous argument, he went one step further and alleged or implied that Nirenberg was somehow involved with this. His campaign had developed this report, and he campaigned against the San Antonio Express News, which was doing solid reporting on this.
He encouraged conspiracy theories.
Yeah, and that's something that I think in a lot of people's minds is unforgivable.
Yeah, I mean, I think 2 years hence, I think a lot of people who find that unforgivable were people who are never going to vote for him anyway.
Probably true.
I just feel like 2 years from now, Nirenberg supporters are going to be talking about this and nobody else is.
Well, that gets to my last question on this topic, which is if he had done 2 months ago or a month ago what he did last week in telling that story, does he win the election against Nirenberg?
I think it's entirely possible. I mean, if he had come out when Brian did his first report on this and acknowledged that the report was real, he could have put it to bed early on.
Oh, yeah. I agree. Like, Annalisa, his wife she was very sympathetic.
Absolutely.
I mean, you watch that interview and it's like no matter what you feel about Greg Brockhouse and his politics and whether he was lying or not, and by the way, he was lying, you came away feeling sympathetic for. I mean, I did,
And I think also, interestingly, I think Brian and I have talked a little bit about this, watching what Brockhouse has been doing since the election, and he's unveiled now this broadcast, right? I mean, it is a kind of a page out of the Trump playbook had he lost in 2016, right? I mean, he's creating a local version of the Brockhouse media, right?
And it should also be noted that on the broadcast, he spent the first broadcast, at least half of it, bashing the Express News and fake news. So
I'm just disappointed that he didn't name it, Brock Around the Clock. But that's not.
So I mean, look, does this thing stay like in on the front burner for folks for the next 2 years? I mean, who knows, right? But he's positioning himself again. We've all said that he's going to run for mayor again. we all believe that it's probably going to happen. I think to kind of take a step forward in this conversation, I think what's interesting is the appointment of Ray Saldana to the VIA board, which adds this very interesting element. I think that there's a couple different thought processes on that.
Probably both true. One is he takes a potential rival and gives him something nice, something, to keep his visibility up, and something, Ray Saldana has developed an expertise in. And, it's Nuremberg helps himself among progressives, especially in a week where, you've got, kind of for some, a scary appointment to your chief of staff in what's his name?
Jim Greenwood.
Jim Greenwood.
Yeah, former Valero executive. So yeah, I mean, the Saldana appointment helped his left wing and takes a potential rival off the field.
But it does it take a potential rival off the field? Is the question, right?
I think part of that was the hope.
That's the hope.
I don't know if actually that's what's going to happen. But
right, and some people think that appointment does in fact remove Ray Saldana from a 2021 mayoral campaign. But I think that what it does is puts Ray into a position where he remains relevant. He has reasons to contact media, stand in front of cameras at a lectern, take on what's going to be the biggest issue of the 2021 term, right, which is Connect SA.
Yeah.
And if there's a sense that Nuremberg has failed, and I think the first 6 to 9 months of this term are going to be vitally important for him.
Right.
And if he doesn't show kind of that pivot to the left, there's Saldana in the wings, ready to go.
Yeah.
If there's a stumble, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And you have to think that Ray Saldana is going to be kind of central to the campaign for Connect SA when it goes to voters. So,
Sure.
It's a smart thing Nuremberg's done here. He's taken a charismatic, political, operative who's going to be, he's not really an operative, but a good charismatic politician who's going to really probably do pretty well in this campaign.
Yeah. And Greg, you mentioned the changes in the mayor's on the mayor's staff, and Trey Jacobson, who was his chief of staff for the first term, is no longer there, and he's been replaced with Jim Greenwood, a former Valero executive, and also Ivalis Gonzalez Mesa, who was on the staff, has now been elevated. I guess they've created a new position for her, like director of policy and public engagement. She is, as many people know, the daughter of the late Choco Mesa, who was a local Democratic Party leader here. Now, by all accounts, Jim Greenwood is a really smart, competent, hardworking individual, has a lot of experience and knows a lot of people in the community, has had a lot of different roles. There was some pushback. I mean, I think in the environmental community, and Josh, I'm sure you know more about this than we do, but just because of that history with Valero. And I'm guessing, I'm not saying this is not something that can't be solved, but I think there's going to be some trust issues that he's going to have to work out.
So, I've seen Jim around City Hall for a number of years, and I can't say that I've ever had a long conversation with him, but I've talked to a lot of people about him, and the kind of portrait that people have painted of him is that, he had this kind of democratic awakening at Valero and decided to leave, and he's been, very involved in the community, and he's really great in front of those kind of business crowds, yet he's somebody who potentially might carry the torch a little bit more for the environmentalists than maybe the environmentalists expect. I don't know. We're gonna have to watch to see what happens, but there's two kind of bifurcated opinions on this, and it could be that he's an old Valero exec and he's going to water down Cap, or he's an old Valero exec who can go into New Star and Valero and say, guys, you got to get on board. This thing, the train's left the station. We're going to pass this. We need to figure out how we can get you guys involved in this.
Don't be scared. This is going to work out.
It's kind of, I guess that's how it's going to play out. I mean, I think the environmental activists, like you said, I mean, they're wary. But I think, a couple of months from now, I bet they'll have a working relationship with him.
And this is the animating issue for Mayor Nuremberg, unless I'm mistaken.
Transportation and climate. Yeah, absolutely. Well, in 1978, Elvis Costello sang, "I want to bite."
This is going.
I want to bite the hand that feeds me. I want to bite that hand so badly. And I was reminded of that lyric reading one of Brian's stories last week, because our former district attorney, Nico LaHood, we learned last week, did bite a hand that feeds him.
His own.
Yeah, his own. So Brian, could you shed a little light on that?
Sure. So Joe Gonzalez, the district attorney, he filed some motions a couple weeks ago. He wants Nico LaHood, who has opened a new law firm, off 3 cases in particular. And these are defendants whom LaHood had actually prosecuted before he left office in December of 2018. One of them was a domestic violence suspect by the name of Michael Stovall, actually the nephew of Robert Stovall, former congressional candidate and Bexar County Republican Party chairman,
right?
Pretty prominent Republican in town. And the way that the biting of the hand came up was there was a prosecutor who Nico had called when he was still DA. He called this prosecutor, his own prosecutor. This is shortly before Nico left office. He called her to his office and was trying to essentially poke holes in the case. Now, we don't know if Nico already knew that he was going to get hired by this defendant whom he was prosecuting at the moment. But one thing he did was, hey, look at these photos, the crime scene photos of the victim. They say these are bite marks. These aren't bite marks. I'll show you a bite mark. And then he bit his own hand. He said, this is a bite mark. And
wow. I mean,
we're observing a moment of silence.
I was going to say, yeah, he really, I have to say, he really commits to an argument. I mean, that's so, well, and when this played out last week, and it was Judge Villamesa who heard the case.
Yes.
Now she concluded that it wasn't a conflict of interest, or what was her exact conclusion?
So there are 3 cases, and each case is different. They have different circumstances. In this one, she was kind of relying on previous case law that said, if the district attorney did not have substantial involvement in the prosecution, then it's not a conflict of interest for that former DA to now defend the client. Some people were saying, how can you say he didn't have substantial involvement when he was actually, the
trying to make that
attorney.
Argument? Yeah.
But that was her conclusion.
And I mean, in looking at this, I mean, I think the people who are supporters of Nico LaHood are going to say, well, Joe Gonzalez, this is, this obviously these people hate each other. Yeah. Is this some kind of like political payback, and obviously, I mean, on the other side, I think this is a really interesting issue in general. When you have a district attorney gets voted out in a primary and then has to spend the next 10 months in office, and they're they're probably planning out what their career is going to look like from then on. There are all kinds of problems with that.
I think undeniably, Nico LaHood, long after he had already decided to start this new law firm, and indeed after he had started advertising for his new law firm, was still, stirring the pot in these cases, and even in this one case that he would pick up just a couple weeks later. But I think the judge was grappling with the idea of, everyone has a right to choose their own counsel. That's a constitutional right, and if you're going to take that away from someone, you got to have a really good reason to do that.
I don't know if there's an answer to this question or not, but how much discretion does a DA have in a situation like that, where he's lost the primary, but he's going to set up his own practice, but he's still in office for another 10 months? Are there any rules guiding what he can and can't do?
Well, there's the Code of Criminal Procedure, which Joe had cited, which states that a district attorney cannot, a former district attorney cannot represent someone who he had prosecuted. That's what Joe was citing. So it seemed pretty clear cut, but then the judge went back into the case law saying, well, you actually have to have substantial involvement in the specific case.
Yeah. That's one of those eye of the beholder type of things. I mean, what does that mean exactly? It's a really interesting story.
There's 2 more cases.
2 more.
Yeah. One of them's a murder case. The other one's tampering with evidence against San Antonio police.
What's the timeline on that as far as when
the other ones are coming up in a couple weeks?
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, Josh, you had a Sunday story in the paper, and this is something you've been covering, I think, over the last month or so. I know there was regarding the spill gates on these dams on Guadalupe River, and I think it was last month one of the gates just collapsed. I can't remember what lake was that.
So on May 14th, about 8:00 in the morning at Lake Dunlap, which is just kind of southeast of New Braunfels, there's 3 spill gates that make up the dam there that holds back the water that creates the lake, and one of them just broke loose from the fittings and went kind of lurching up and out, and then crashed down in the downriver area below, which led to a quote dewatering unquote of the lake, which basically means that Lake Dunlap is no longer a lake; it's the Guadalupe River going through the path that you know, the lake once was, and so these like kind of mud flats that have now dried, and now there's this lush green grass that's grown there, and people no longer have lakefront property. They have backyards that back up to now these grassy flats that, you know, then there's the original river channel that runs through there, and the Guadalupe River is flowing through. So it's the second spillgate failure of a GBRA dam system since 2016. There's another lake called Lake Wood, where the same thing happened. Very, very similar thing happened anyway. So there's no longer a lake there as well. So there's 4 remaining lakes, including Lake McQueenie, which is kind of the highest profile of the lakes. And I talked to a lot of people there who are extremely worried that they may no longer have lakefront property as well.
Trying to sell their property off or thinking about it.
There's a lot of conversations about that. There's a lot of conversations actually happening now among homeowners who want to create a special taxing district to come up with some money that would help fund the replacement. So it's $179 million to replace all 15 spill gates across these 6 dams. It's a couple different counties, several school districts. The kind of prevailing wisdom is that if you lose your lakefront property, your property values decline by about 50%. There's about $550 million in value at McQueenie. And so the folks actually at Dunlap have taken the preliminary steps of putting together the paperwork that would lead to an election that would tax lakefront property owners. They're assessed a linear foot tax. Lakefront linear foot is part of how their properties are assessed. And so they're talking about tacking on an additional $6 to $8 per linear foot.
Would that tax be enough to cover the cost? No. It's just a fraction of it, I guess.
Yeah, and it's hard to tell. You know, we haven't pulled the actual property assessments from the Guadalupe Appraisal District yet. And the president of Lake Association up there, Preserve Lake Dunlap Association, he believes that $6 to $8 per linear foot gets them into the ballpark with assistance from Guadalupe County and from GBRA. He couldn't tell me exactly what GBRA was going to do because this has all kind of become a really big deal because GBRA does not receive any tax dollars. They make all of their money mostly from the sale of water and then the treatment of wastewater. These 6 lakes were hydroelectric lakes that were built in the 1920s and 30s to generate electricity, and GBRA acquired them in 1963, continued to generate electricity, but for many, many years now, they've been unable to make a profit because of deregulation and because of cheap natural gas. And so basically these hydroelectric dams have been working maybe about even or a little bit at a deficit. And so they have no capital saved that would be able to bond against. And so they've basically said, we're willing to do anything we can to help, but we don't have any money to fix these things. And hydroelectric in the foreseeable future is not going to be a revenue generator.
I think your article mentioned attempts to try to get some state funding. I mean, is that not likely at this point? Or
it seems to be at best in the 2021 legislature. John Kemple, who's the representative from Seguin, spoke at a really big public meeting. I've covered a lot of public meetings in my career, and I've never been to one that had 900 plus people all there wanting to hear about what was going to happen with these lakes. And Kemple basically said, look, if this had happened in February, there was a good chance we might have been able to get some funding, but it happened, May 14th. And the budget was all but done, and they tried an add a rider. It just didn't work. And so the state came up with no money. There's no flood control money because these aren't flood controlled lakes. So they've checked under all the rocks, and basically the upshot is that save some mysterious federal grant. There's really no way to come up with any money. There's a big question. The big revenue receiver from the property tax on all these lakes are the school districts. We haven't heard anything from them yet as to whether, if you lose 50% of your value and the school districts take 80-something% of that tax bill, that means that they're going to take the biggest hit on devalued property. Right. But it's also, not until this happened in May, so we won't see impacts on the Dunlap property valuations until 2020, right? Because it's your valuation is based on the status of your property on January 1st. So there's it's a slow trickle on the impact,
sure.
and people really want their lake back. So 3-year process once they get the funding to design and to
not fast enough for people.
So for the foreseeable future, there will not be a Lake Dunlap. And and GBRA has halted all work on the existing 4 dams that have not failed. I should say spill gates. And basically, there was one lady who had in my story who had spoken to people from GBRA who told her it's not if McQueenie's going to fail, it's when. And so everybody there is prepared for an eventual failure of a spill gate there. And that's a big hit. There's a lot of people who actually live on that lake full time. At Dunlap as well, and so you talk about a major change to your kind of way of life. It's a pretty big deal for those folks for sure.
Well, before we wrap things up, I wanted to talk a little bit about something the council is looking at this week, and they called a special meeting for Monday afternoon. We're recording this Monday morning. By the time you listen to this, you'll know more about what the council ended up doing. But they're looking at simultaneously talking about instituting a $5,000 homestead exemption, and also considering a possible property tax increase at the same time. And to give you some context, as many of you know, the state legislature passed a bill which will impose caps on cities. I think it's 3.5% revenue caps. Beyond that, if it goes beyond that, it goes to the voters. The voters will have to approve that. And also, San Antonio, I think in recent years, and Josh, you've been covering this, but I mean, the city has had pretty good fortune when it comes to revenue in recent years. I mean, they haven't really had a lot of problems, but I think this year we're hearing that CPS revenue is down somewhat. They're also going to lose, I think, about $7 million in fees from telecom companies because of a state law which eliminated one fee. So there's some issues they're looking at, and what I'm interested in is why they're considering this homestead exemption now, what the politics of it are, because the estimate is that this would cost the city about another $6 million in revenue at a time when things are a little tighter than usual.
Well, I mean, look, John Courage and Clayton Perry have been on the boat with Brockhouse in the past about trying to get a homestead exemption in. I feel like, having not been a City Hall reporter for a while now and not having kind of had my pulse on everything, I feel like this is kind of a token move to the 48% of folks who voted for Greg Brockhouse. In a $5,000 homestead exemption, I will get crap from people like Brockhouse for saying this, but that's really not going to have much of an impact on most people's property tax bills.
$28, I think. Yeah.
And it will have an impact on the city budget, and that's unfortunate, I think, in many ways. And then you layer on this idea of raising the property tax, in just kind of quick napkin math on this, I think what it's going to do is kind of further complicate the affordable housing issue, because it's going to give a very, very slight reduction to owner-occupied properties.
Right.
But anybody who lives in a house and they're renting, it's going to be something that's passed on to them. And so you can make an argument that, and I think the demographics have shifted some, but you can make an argument that, generally speaking, people with more means own houses and people with less means rent houses. And so those people are going to be impacted negatively by this.
Yeah, but the alternative, politically and only politically, is horrific looking. I mean, it's like we're thinking about jacking up your property tax rate, and screw you on any other kind of relief on your property tax bill. It's unpalatable. I just can't.
I will continue to beat this drum to the day I die. There's nothing that we can do at a local level to truly address the issue that we have with property taxes.
Well, but that's why I said political, because it's it's a political solution. You're right, but I mean it's. I think a lot of homeowners actually do understand that, but they also are unwilling to abide their city council members and their mayor doing nothing about these property tax increases they've seen over the last several years.
Yeah, but they need to be banging on the doors in Austin telling
Right, but
their
I'm
legislature
talking about,
to deal
real-
with this. Yeah, and
real
so look,
voters.
the real voters are at least you see a city that's acknowledging
Right.
the struggles, but the city's been dealt this hand that's unfortunate, and it's based primarily on what state lawmakers have done or refused to do.
And this session, they did address, the school funding, which, as many of you know, that's about 50% really of your property tax bill. The city part of it's a little over 20%. Now, the legislature didn't really deal with how they're going to fund schools long term. They're kind of using some short term, funding sources that will get us through the next few years. But that's going to be the question. But they have kind of addressed that. And I guess I wonder if the council simultaneously institutes this homestead exemption and maybe brings up people's property tax rate slightly, will the community react to it as this is a good thing, or will they say they raise our property taxes?
Well, I mean, part of it, this is going to be a real test for Ron Nirenberg. I mean, is he going to be able to finally talk to voters in a way where he's bringing them along? He's sketching out his vision for the city and the importance of city services, parks, libraries, and apart from public safety and street repair. Like, can he actually sell them on?
Has he made any direct statements about this struggle? Because the Austin mayor has, and I thought that's instructive. I mean, the mayor of Austin is already talking through this with his constituents.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah. And I mean, this they'll again, by the time you hear this, there will probably be more on this. But and obviously the council is addressing this Monday afternoon. But up to this point, the mayor hasn't really committed, I don't think, to the idea of property tax increase. He's been open to it, but I don't think he's really committed himself.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if, like in the past, he's talked about controversial positions he's taken, decisions in a really narrow way, like without any trying to talk as little about it as possible. I wonder if he's going to take the same approach this time.
Yeah. Will be very interesting. Well, we're going to leave you on that note. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch up with you next week. Take care.